Good afternoon. My name is Paul Ryer, and I'm the Director of Scholar Programs at the School for Advanced Research. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the final colloquium of the 2020 academic year. And before I begin, I'd like to just make a couple of announcements. Tomorrow, SAR is hosting a talk with Navajo weaver Venancio Aragon at 5:30 p.m. And then on Tuesday, December 1st, we will have our first ever SAR Press book talk with the editors, virtual book talk, I should say, with the editors of two volumes, SAR volumes, Archaeologies of Empire and Imperial Formations. That will be at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, Tuesday, December 1st. If you are unable to have watched any of the earlier colloquia or these events, please check our YouTube channel. We post events as soon as possible following their conclusion. Today's talk, after my introduction of our speaker, we'll hear his talk, and then SAR President Michael Brown and I will join our speaker, Stephen Sullivan, and have a question and answer session. So if you have a question during the talk, please go to our Q&A tab in your screen and type in your question. We will get those and do our best to answer all of them. It depends on how many we get, and sometimes we have to collate two similar questions to get as many answers as possible. But please don't hesitate to put in a question, much appreciated. All right, it is my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Sullivan, one of our two 2020 to 2021 Mellon Fellows for this year. And thanks also to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for supporting this fellowship, as well as to our members for their support of SAR in general. Stephen Sullivan is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Northwestern University, and his project while at SAR, which he'll speak about today, is titled Amplifying Gentrification, Contestations of Sound and Space in Brooklyn, New York. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Sullivan.
We gathered around the community center meeting room on a crisp October evening to discuss plans for an upcoming action at the New York City Department of City Planning, which has its main office in Lower Manhattan near Wall Street. The plan was to have a march outside the office as well as a protest inside the building's lobby against gentrification and the resulting waves of displacement that have proliferated in majority Black and brown neighborhoods across Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Lower Manhattan. A citywide coalition of housing and anti-gentrification groups were to participate, and individual members could either join the outside march or the inside protest. We went around in a circle discussing our comfort levels with each. One attendee asked exactly what the inside part entailed. An organizer explained that it was a noise demonstration. Quote, there would be a lot of noise being made. The lobby is huge and it has good acoustics, so it'll be loud. He continued to explain that the noise would be a risk variable, potentially designated as a disturbance, and thus prone to police intervention and/or harassment. About half of us agreed to join the inside group, and the other half would lead the march. For the rest of the meeting, we discussed logistics and riffed some chant ideas to be used next week. Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Sullivan, and I'm a resident scholar at SAR for the 2020-2021 school year. I'm also a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Northwestern University. I'd like to thank SAR and the Mellon Foundation for allowing me to present my work and to be in conversation with you all. During this presentation, I'm going to give an overview of my dissertation research, which is the writing project that I'm working on this year. My work examines the soundscapes of gentrification and anti-gentrification activism in Brooklyn, New York. I completed a year of fieldwork this past summer, with the latter half being conducted from March to August during the pandemic. During this period, my fieldwork was conducted almost exclusively online, having to adapt on the fly to the new reality that we all find ourselves in. So with this in mind, I appreciate any feedback you may have, as this is all very new to me. Beginning to write up this research has been strange. Anthropologists typically have to draw spatial and temporal boundaries to mark the beginning and the end of their field research. These are always arbitrary to a certain extent, but are necessary heuristics for data collection and analysis to mark a moment in time and space to focus on. For me, these boundary lines sort of feel even more forced, but I'm hoping that through this discomfort, something generative can emerge, not just about the work I did, but perhaps the nature of ethnography and anthropology more generally. So before jumping in, I'd like to give a quick overview of how I structured the talk. First, I'll provide the general framing and themes, the who, what, where, and the scholarly concepts that are animating my research. Then I'll jump into some ethnographic examples to demonstrate the project's interventions. And then I'll end by briefly discussing an overall view of where I'm hoping to take the dissertation, some chapter ideas, and some broader threads that I'm going to take up through writing this year. My objectives today with the talk are to foster an appreciation for the richness of sound as a social phenomenon that can be studied both ethnographically and historically, to highlight the ways that sound and noise are operationalized as tactics of resistance and solidarity work, and lastly, to argue for listening as ethnographic and civic practice within everyday urban spaces and beyond. Now to jump in. When I say the word gentrification, what immediately comes to mind? For many people, perhaps images of trendy cafes and art galleries, new architectural styles, tropes of urban renewal, artists, hipsters. These are aesthetic signifiers. They mark political, economic processes of urbanization and reflect shifting cultural tastes, community groups, modes of consumption. Put simply, they're shorthand for recognizing the presence of gentrification in a given neighborhood. And we can even try to approximate how far along this process is using these visual cues. So maybe a Whole Foods comes like several stages after the first small art gallery. Increasingly, however, academic and popular news accounts of gentrification are recognizing the significance of sound and noise, I guess, more specifically, within processes of neighborhood transformation. Often the narrative is framed specifically about the presence and problem of noise. Quote, and usually the narrative will go, complaints to local 311 hotlines about loud neighbors are rising, often initiated by newcomers against long-timers in gentrifying neighborhoods. Usually these trends map onto dynamics of race and class, with a sort of upper white class gentry problematizing the perceived noise levels of a more lower class or lower income residents of color. These accounts often rely on quantitative data analysis of publicly available city data, and some of the more sophisticated models even bake into account the types of noises and the neighborhoods and sort of look at the trends through these lenses. City agencies and sound research groups in response use these reports to offer mitigation plans ranging from sensors that monitor the concentration of loud or dangerous noises to referrals to private services to make buildings more soundproof or other kinds of built environment sort of things. My project, however, is less interested in the so-called problem of noise than understanding urban neighborhood sounds more capaciously as social phenomenon in the context of rapid cultural and political economic change. I aim to dig deeper into how everyday sounds, protest sounds, and music invoke ideologies of race and class, emerge from histories of social movements and struggle, and become ways for different groups of residents to claim space in a neighborhood that's increasingly inaccessible to them. This, I believe, is the strength of anthropology in general and ethnography more specifically, to offer an on-the-ground account of gentrification and its discontents. So before I jump into my research questions, I want to first briefly explain how social scientists conceptualize sound and how I'm thinking about it in this project. In its most basic sense, sounds are vibrations. Some are perceptible to us, others are not. Sound becomes a ripe field for social science research when we broaden our understanding of what the senses are and how they function, and how we experience and move through the world. Stefan Helmreich defines the anthropology of sound as, quote, the ways humans experience the realm of sound and how perceptions and technologies of sound emerge from cultural, economic, and historical worlds. Noise, for example, is a relational term, meaning what counts as noisy for you or for me may differ and may be informed by and reproduce cultural context, power, and social relations. I follow the lead of anthropologists and sound study scholars by treating sound not as inconsequential background noise, but as central to how people experience, contest, and make sense of the world through what Stephen Feld calls acoustemology. Hearing, as Miyaku Une puts it, is an effect of a regime of social power, whereby qualities like noise are given value or stigma and become linked to categories of people and ideologies of race. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that sound is experienced on a plane separate from the other senses. Tim Ingold reminds us that sense perception is integrative. The senses are different not because they convey different information, but are different aspects of action. We don't delegate our senses when we walk through the world, but we go through it as one embodied whole. So my project is not merely responding to some notion of ocular centrism, either in anthropology or in studies of gentrification. But rather, I think by asking questions about sound and noise and listening, I aim to refocus discussions onto the embodied and affective aspects of gentrification and of protest among residents. This intersects with scholarly discussions about mobility, space, and belonging, and are necessarily structured by city and local policy, with their effects differentially felt for different groups of people, among other categories like race and class and gender. My aim is also to be in conversation with scholarly and non-academic conversations of policing and surveillance, particularly to connect local quotidian experience at the neighborhood level with broader US national politics and social movements. This project is guided by three main research questions. First, how do longtime Latinx residents and white newcomers claim public space and build community through sound practices? Two, what is the role of sound, like music or chants, within forms of anti-gentrification dissent? And lastly, how do judgments about sound frame local political debates of gentrification and facilitate the exclusion of certain race and class residents from the neighborhood's future? So a little bit about my field site. I examined these questions in Bushwick, a working class, predominantly Latinx Brooklyn neighborhood experiencing a form of rapid gentrification that's pretty endemic to cities across the United States. Bushwick residents shape a pretty vibrant urban soundscape through a range of distinct practices. These sounds include the hip-hop beats of DJs hired to play for business storefronts, dance music spilling onto major streets from trendy new bars, or the blared words of evangelical sermons over loudspeakers every weekend in the neighborhood's major public park. In the context of rapid gentrification, I see these quotidian practices as claims to the social and political space of the neighborhood by residents whose backgrounds vary in terms of race, class, time in the neighborhood, language use. Prior research suggests that the conflicts over the aesthetics of public space reflect concerns over the shifting political economic conditions and tensions about belonging. As Jessica Winokur notes, following Jacques Rancière, aesthetics are, quote, the ground for and means of transformative political action. So to contextualize these dynamics in Bushwick in historical terms, the origins of these social and spatial contestations are major demographic shifts resulting from decades-long cycles of devalorization and development. During the 70s and 80s, the predominantly Latinx working-class immigrant neighborhood experienced widespread poverty as a result of urban disinvestment. Between the 80s into the late 90s, Mayors Ed Koch and Rudy Giuliani introduced a series of neoliberal economic development and NYPD crime-fighting measures focused on neighborhoods like Bushwick throughout most of Brooklyn. Investment developers subsequently flocked to the neighborhood following a first wave of gentrification, and particularly around the Maria Hernandez Park, which is the northern section of Bushwick. Artists and young professionals, once concentrated in Lower Manhattan and then Williamsburg, seized the affordable rental space throughout the 2000s, spurring the most recent wave of gentrification and the expansion of an artistic middle-class culture. According to the NYU Furman Center, Bushwick's average rent increase was double the New York City average from 1990 to 2010-2014, so about 44% increase versus the city average, which is 22%. And the neighborhood demographics have shifted dramatically between 2000 and 2015. So the Latinx population decreased by 13%, while the white population increased 610%. So now that you have some background, a bit about my approach. My project's primary methodology is sound ethnography. This is a version of what's popularly known as sensory ethnography, but that prioritizes listening as an ethnographic practice and sound as an object of study. I conducted 13 months of ethnographic fieldwork, building on 2 summers research during the summers of 2017 and 2018. And my methods included participant observation, semi-structured and unstructured interviews, and archival and media data collection. Like I mentioned, the latter half of my work was conducted virtually. And so in my prospectus, I had also planned another major method called sound walks. And sound walks are a method that involve walking through neighborhood space with interlocutors and sort of recording it and asking for their reflections on the neighborhood sounds, things that spontaneously come up, discussions, memories, and feelings. And they're particularly good at getting judgments about what does or doesn't belong. But unfortunately, because of the timing of the work relative to the pandemic, I wasn't able to do sound walks with interlocutors. I was able to do them solo and was able to sort of use it as comparative data to the solo sound walks I did towards the beginning of my fieldwork, but it wasn't exactly in the way that I had anticipated. So fieldwork was conducted primarily with local grassroots organizers, residents, and community members. I joined and worked closely with an anti-gentrification organizing collective, who I won't name to protect their identities. The group was founded by long-term Latinx residents and had membership that included a pretty wide variety of people, including long-timers, newcomers, people who grew up in Bushwick or who didn't, various race, gender, and class backgrounds. I also participated in numerous neighborhood events and social gatherings in both public and private spaces. I attended regular community board meetings and observed many in-person and virtual protests related to a range of issues that included gentrification, but were also intersecting with housing issues, labor, policing, and the environment. So now, to return to some more ethnography, I'll pick up from the opening scene. The plans were set. Before embarking to Manhattan, I stopped at the community center to pick up a bullhorn, which was to be used by the outside protesters for maximum amplification. I took the subway from Brooklyn down to Zuccotti Park, the meeting spot for all of the participants of the protest. The park holds significance for being the site of the original Occupy Wall Street protest 8 years prior, as well as its location in the financial district and proximity to many city government buildings, including the Department of City Planning. Upon arrival, there were dozens of participants getting ready, a few main organizers preparing their remarks, some people were socializing, and others were handing out snacks and water bottles. About a half hour later, the group separated, with about 2/3 in the outdoor camp and 1/3, including myself, for the indoor camp. Our group made our way to the DCP through a subway platform, which led directly into the lobby. We remained silent during our walk through the corridor, emerging to the lobby with the full voices of chants. "Mic check," one of the main organizers shouted out, to begin the human microphone technique, wherein the rest of us would repeat her words to amplify without the use of a bullhorn. She began chanting, and the rest of us echoed, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, DCP has got to go. Save our homes, don't rezone. AMI is too damn high." Our voices, like the organizer the previous week anticipated, echoed very effectively against the large walls and high ceilings, easily filling the huge lobby despite us only taking up a fraction of the space, remaining tightly condensed for reasons of safety and organization. The door person quickly called for security, and within moments, about a dozen private security and NYPD officers surrounded the entire group. The scene escalated fast, with the group getting progressively louder to be able to speak over the officers. As one of the main organizers began to give a speech about displacement due to gentrification, an officer began playing a pre-recorded message over a bullhorn, threatening arrest if we did not leave the premises for unlawful assembly. Speakers continued onward, with the rest of the group filling the air between speakers with chants that overpowered the officer's messages. Upon the conclusion of the last speaker's speech, and with a collective feeling about the possibility of action by the police, the group decided to exit the lobby and join the outside group, which had congregated on the other side of the office doors. They welcomed us with a loud chant, the two groups melding together in voice and continuing the protest outside DCP, amplified further with bullhorns and drums. There was a sense of de-escalation as we exited the private lobby and congregated on the public sidewalk. The night ended with a rally back in Zuccotti Park, with various speakers detailing the harm of city policies, a quieter but nonetheless powerful series of testimonies that were documented on social media to be shared beyond the time and space of the gathering. Reflecting back on this ethnographic moment, something that strikes me is the fluid relationship between the publicness of space, the loudness of protesters, and the threat of arrest. The spatial composition of the DCP lobby was integral to the effectiveness and visibility or audibility of the action. In conversations afterwards with interlocutors, they made it clear that noise demonstrations are tactics, not the end in and of itself to protest. Making noise was a way to mark presence and to take up space, to capture wider attention of people passing by, and to capture the attention on social media in the various videos and pictures that were shared later. But it's also powerful as an inversion or maybe reclamation of these communities' supposed noisiness, a rejection of both the respectability politics and the policing and criminalization they face in their everyday lives in their neighborhoods in Brooklyn. With the sonic color line, Jennifer Lynn Stover considers how the senses, especially sound, discipline the body. By that, she means how our bodies generally, and ears specifically, are trained to listen to certain social cues and sort of hear race as well as see it. Her research analyzes sound and listening across US history as bases for which ideologies of racism become sensible or internalized within and across both white and black public spheres. She offers the concept of the sonic color line, which, quote, produces, codes, and polices racial difference through the ear, enabling us to hear race as well as see it. And it's articulated by things like vocal timbre, accents, and musical tones. The sonic color line, I think, very much undergirds the ways that noise becomes a basis for forms of policing and the targeting sort of lower income communities in neighborhoods like Bushwick. And we can think of it too on a larger scale with the trend sort of that I opened with about the 311 noise complaints as like a quantitative indication of how these things take shape. And usually the sort of flip side of this is that also what becomes coded as acceptable is sort of a peaceful protest. And that was a category that was very relevant and emerged pretty visibly during the Black Lives Matter uprisings this past summer. In the case of the DCP protests, it's the protesters' unruly affect, the contrast to it that renders them as threats. This unruliness is registered through both visual and sonic cues, as well as the kind of space that they wrongfully occupy. In this case, a city office, which holds inordinate power over their daily lives. Some of the chants, like the one that referenced AMI, marked an otherwise pretty technical term, a wonky term that references the area media income that is used to make determinations of eligibility for affordable housing. A key criticism of AMI, at least in the way that the city calculates it, is that it uses income data across the 5 boroughs as well as parts of Long Island and Westchester County, which have the effect of inflating the numbers and making large swaths of people who live in neighborhoods like Bushwick ineligible for affordable housing. So while I'm not planning to discuss this in detail in this presentation, this figure is actually a major contributor to the sorts of displacement that those in my field sites experienced, and was also a key organizing point around a proposed rezoning of the neighborhood, which was sort of the focus of my fieldwork prior to the pandemic. Anthropologist Laura Kunrather, in her ethnographic research on Occupy Balawtar protests in Nepal, notes that, quote, noise always threatens to become polluting, to be read by authorities or those on the street as merely chaotic disturbances that make no sense and need to be brought under regulation. And so I think we see a similar logic undergirding the response to the Black Lives Matter protests the valorization of peaceful as a category of protest, and the consensus that riots, looting, or other forms of more vacuous protests lack meaning or cogency. Kuhn rather attributes these sorts of responses to the hegemony of ideals of liberal democracy, like a rational public sphere, this idea of like debate and talking through our conflicts. And so what the DCP action, I think, like the Black Lives Matter protests share, is a rejection of these foundations, in part because the sort of official channels through which political change is often conceived of have proven ineffective in a lot of ways for these communities. A different, more charged affect animated both of those protests and were a large part of why they succeeded in proliferating new and radically different ideas about what's possible by and for communities. And so this transitions well to the final ethnographic section of my talk. As I mentioned with the latter half of my fieldwork during the pandemic, it sort of became necessarily context, but also part of the work insofar as it amplified issues that were already being organized around in my field site, things like displacement, housing, labor issues. And so I recently published a piece in Anthro on the sounds of COVID that sort of captures some of these transitions that I had to make in focus and in method in my work. So for the next part of the presentation, I'll expand a little bit on that original article that sort of mapped out some of these arguments. And my aim with this section, alongside the previous ethnographic example, is to demonstrate the ways that I think sound ethnography is particularly well equipped to sort of thread together the pre-pandemic in-person fieldwork, the more traditional fieldwork that I conducted, with the pandemic, mostly virtual fieldwork that's sort of becoming a necessary tool of anthropology. Throughout the first few months of the pandemic, several sounds come to mind. Pots and pans banging every night at 7 p.m. for medical workers, the constant sirens during the peak of the outbreak in Brooklyn, the relative silence of the city streets as most people were at home. The 7 p.m. cheer in particular took off around the world during the first several weeks, wherein participants would clap for essential workers each night. The ritual was quickly commodified in the form of commercials by companies ranging from Macy's and Samsung to ExxonMobil. They used a popular form of the ritual, generally associated with language of coming together and honoring frontline workers, or heroes as they're designated more specifically. There's a great video that actually links together these commercials and shows how they follow a very similar template, and that they open with sort of ideas about belonging and use musical cues and imagery to sort of evoke a very strong feeling of coming together despite social and physical isolation. In my article, I argue that this has a depoliticizing effect, and that these emotions or affects are stripped of their contextual meaning as recognition of the precarity of medical workers and put to more general aestheticized use for the promotion of corporate brands and products. It's not surprising that the ritual also attracted the attention of city and local state officials, and as I argued, sort of worked as part of a general permission structure to obscure the roots of the crisis and to offer more tangible solutions to the crisis. So it became more about our collective resolve rather than providing sick leave, supplies, rent cancellation, etc. A ritual of banging pots and pans was also being used by local activists across Brooklyn as casalerasos to call attention to the precarious conditions of frontline workers, as well as to promote a rent strike. The casaleraso is distinct as a form of anti-fascist protest in Latin America. And this historical citation is important in that it reflects a tradition of leftist anti-fascist dissent, but it also contrasts with a more generalized form of coming together, which sort of proliferated as the 7 p.m. cheer became commodified and became part of a sort of overall state strategy. I attended several virtual rallies wherein mostly Latinx and Black organizers shared stories of how those who were most marginalized in the communities were struggling under COVID. These rallies ended with everyone participating in a casaleraso, sort of filling a virtual soundscape, as I mentioned in the article. And so as video conferencing and Zoom and social media have taken a dominant part in our lives during the pandemic, I think there's actually a lot of great sort of media analysis and social media analysis one can do from a sonic perspective specifically. And my own soundscape also just sort of changed and was very much part of the field notes I was taking during the peak of the pandemic. So as it got warmer outside, I would constantly hear ice cream truck music from outside my window. And the New York Times actually ended up releasing a video documenting a local driver and his desire to use his status as an essential worker to bring a sense of normalcy and joy to people in the neighborhood. So you can see in some of the YouTube comments on the right that that these were really resonant with people and comforting in a period of heightened stress and precarity, something that sort of we would always necessarily take for granted each summer. And so what I hope these examples show is that sensory matter, like city noises and sounds, are loaded with social and political meaning. Paying deeper attention to how these become part of our lives, evoke feelings, memories, are commodified, become part of a protest, and gain popular attention are important not just in anthropology, but for broader discussions outside of the academy. And this is particularly true for the times we're living in now. So I'd like to end by offering some summarizing thoughts on how I'm making scholarly interventions, as well as the threads I want to take up with the rest of the dissertation. Ethnographies on the gentrification of Latinx neighborhood have documented the diverse ways that residents reshape public space and engage in creative forms of resistance in the face of displacement. My project brings this work into conversation with recent sound ethnographies on democratic protest to conceptualize subtler forms of protest, particularly among longtime Latinx residents whose ability to engage in more overt forms of dissent are hampered by contemporary right-wing anti-immigrant hostility, as well as heightened forms of policing. Explorations of Latinx community and sound have usually centered around music and language, and those intersections with racialization. My project engenders questions about the role of sound specific to processes of urban change, thereby contributing to ongoing discussions about the remaking of cities through affect and racial difference, spatial governance, and cultural expression. By analyzing sound as protest sounds and affective politics, my project expands discussions of how those in precarious conditions engage in alternative, everyday forms of protest and political participation. This intervention is crucial for understanding less overt ways that communities like those in Bushwick maintain senses of belonging and make claims to space and sort of mark their presence in the face of rapid change, undemocratic housing and land policy, as well as heightened forms of policing. I plan to take up listening and sound through different lenses and issues throughout the dissertation. This includes digging deeper into the sounds of COVID and how they relate back to issues of gentrification, a chapter on policing and surveillance and its intersection with listening cultures, a section on the semiotics of gentrification as a social category in both online and offline spaces, and a chapter on social media, sort of documenting the ways that these frameworks move in between online and offline spaces. My aim is to critically examine, in addition to these threads, the way that the category of an authentic resident is conceived and the extent to which certain residents can make claims to the neighborhood space. As I mentioned, a rezoning fight was sort of the main focus of my work before the pandemic, and I think there were a lot of interesting ways that local officials, even those who grew up in Bushwick, sort of used that authority to sort of claim that newer residents couldn't make claims to sort of the space in the way that older residents could. And that actually contrasted a lot with the group that I worked with, which welcomed sort of solidarity between those who were newcomers and long-timers. So it's kind of an inversion of what the typical gentrification narrative entails and dissent. Something I also want to contend with in the dissertation is my own role and presence in the research. At times, the lines between participant and observer felt blurred, given both the nature of my work and also my level of involvement supporting and researching and documenting various forms of protest and dissent. And so I sort of like accidentally fell into an activist anthropology role, and that's not necessarily an identity I would claim, but I think it's one that I necessarily have to grapple with. And also just because I think sound ethnography lends itself to a politically engaged anthropology in that it directs current conversations, which are pretty dominant on topics like embodiment and affect, but also to consider their intersections with material concerns and local policy and land use and how noise kind of ties all of these things together. And actually, in a recent talk on the case for letting anthropology burn, the participants argued for sort of anthropology to abandon its liberal humanist suppositions. And I think sound ethnography works as one pathway among many to more closely examining what a different type of world could look or sound like. Thinking back to the DCP protests that I talked about, its critique of respectability norms and social movements, but then also the Casa de Rasos during COVID and how they built solidarity with workers and called for radical changes to how we think about labor and housing and these sorts of things. So I hope this presentation has made a good case as to why these are meaningful and politically urgent endeavors.
Stephen, that was great fun to listen to. Thank you. And before we get going, I remember being intrigued by a linguistic anthropologist pointing out a paradox in studying language, in that we can only understand language through language. And similarly, the paradox that kept coming to mind thinking about sound through your presentation was the paradox that I can only make sense of it through your speech, through the sound, through sound. So it's an interesting parallel there. That wasn't a question. I think we have a first question. Michael, do you want me to do the first question here?
Why don't you go ahead, Paul?
Okay. We have a question from Aisa Kurtz. I am hearing a lot about certain sounds or noise you observed, but I wonder if your research also documented the absence of sounds in the audio-typical ecology of Bushwick.
Yeah, thank you for that. That actually was, I think, one of the first things I noticed when I was doing my preliminary work was the sort of the juxtaposition, particularly like in the parts of the neighborhood that are most gentrified, between like this desire for silence or quietness, like say like in certain cafe spaces and things that are like pretty like strongly associated with gentrification, versus then you go outside and you know there's like loud music playing or cars passing by. And actually there was one encounter with a barista I had where I was ordering something and some like loud music drove by and the doors were open, and so it like interrupted our speech, and like he made some kind of joke about that and like, oh, like, you know, what was that about or something. And it was this like moment of kind of like noticing that spatially these sorts of things came into contact, but and it's not sort of like an explicit, like, you know, it wasn't like a bother or something, but there's kind of multiple kinds of communities in Bushwick, and I think where kind of more quietness or where loudness is appreciated and reproduced, like I think that tells us a lot about the kinds of communities that are still there and their ideals about like, okay, what is this neighborhood supposed to sound like? So it's definitely there, silences.
I have a related question, Stephen, and it occurred to me while you were talking about the Times article about the ice cream truck sound, but there were also articles in the Times and elsewhere in the country about the silence and the effect of nature sounds, bird songs that people hadn't heard before. And in fact, there's some scientific evidence that the bird songs actually changed in response to the silence. And then there are these extreme cases of animals kind of taking over public spaces. I saw some amazing film from the UK or Scotland about the sheep and goats kind of swarming over towns because people were, you know, stayed in their houses. So how do you work through, of course, this is not political in itself, it's kind of anti-political, I guess you could say, but, or non-political, but was that something that came up when you were talking to people about life in Bushwick?
Not particularly like in Bushwick. I did like it was a broader thing that I definitely also saw in the Times, and I think what was more interesting to me about those articles was just like the romanticism and like the kind of the novelty of it, which to me indicated like people were listening more attentively, like on a pretty wide scale. And, you know, these sorts of things, like in a way, like it made me feel like the focus on sound had some more urgency than anything else.
Mhm.
But I don't necessarily think it came up too much in Bushwick with at least the folks that I talked to.
It seemed like there's sort of a nature culture dynamic going on where, you know, suddenly people were not occupying their normal spaces, and that the natural or the non-human world was sort of came to fill it up, and, you know, with mixed results, I guess you could say. But it was I think it's one of the more memorable things about the shutdown, and I wonder if there's some way that you could weave it into your analysis, especially when you're interviewing people about their experiences of that difficult period.
Right. I mean, definitely in terms of movement, you know, who was able to work from home, who still had to go out, you know, where these kinds of observations were made, I think tells us a lot about, you know, like in a neighborhood like Bushwick, where I think disproportionately people were still going out, were still working. So like in my mind, like the kind of, you know, maybe like a flaneur type figure who could like appreciate these sounds from like the comfort of their apartments, you know, it might be more geographic to say Manhattan over Brooklyn. I don't know if that's true or not, but these sorts of things I think come up when we think about that too.
Sure. No, thank you. Paul?
For sure. We have a question from George Villanueva. Expanding reflexively on his role in the research, what is Mr. Sullivan's relationship to Bushwick? Are you from there, and how do you map your own social and racial identities in conversation with the communities you are studying? How does this impact the future of the research?
It's a good question. So I'm not from Bushwick. I grew up on Long Island. I guess like, I mean, so when I did my master's at the New School, that's when I sort of made my like big move to the city. And I lived in Ridgewood, it borders Bushwick and shares a lot of the similar dynamics, like in terms of the gentrification that's happening, the racial composition, not quite the same, but pretty similar. And they're so close to each other that there's so much overlap. And so I guess my interest in Bushwick was in part because it's so embedded in the culture industry, because it's such a commodity, like just Bushwick itself, where, you know, you could have these like world-renowned like fashion shows and like attracts people from all over the world at the same time that there's such deep poverty, and just how those two things could, you know, sort of both define Bushwick and just like the claims that each kind of person who would be embedded in those communities would make to the neighborhood was just like interesting to me. And then in terms of my own identity, I mean, I think initially when I was starting out, it was the long timers, the Latinx populations that kind of knew that I wasn't from Bushwick, and the white newcomers who thought I was. So I don't know that I ever resolved that, but I think in part my focus or my desire to work with activists was, I mean, really just motivated by being a gentrifier and myself, and like, you know, wanting to do something about that. And I think that was something I found was a pretty big pattern among a lot of the people I talked to and interacted with regularly, was this sense that there's like deep like awareness. I think Japonica Brown Saraceno has talked about this in her work in terms of, I think in her work it's social preservationists, like this idea that people who go to a gentrifying neighborhood are pretty acutely aware of it generally, and, you know, actively try to do something about it to help those that have been there for a long time. And so I guess that was the initial urge, and working through all the contradictions of my presence there was difficult, but I think ultimately pushed me to think as critically as I could about this work.
Stephen, there's a question here from Amy Schiffer, an SAR staff member. She asks, since sound is something that carries and is heard by all in the area, could you comment more on the role of or the impact of the sound on observers and bystanders, and which might be a reference to your opening vignette. So you're part of this protest. Obviously, we know what the impact was on the police and security, but outside of the building, what was your sense? Did it generate conversations? Did it generate support, outrage? How did it work?
Yeah, it definitely generated conversations with people just passing by. I think once, you know, at most, like everyone was outside, there were people passing by who had no idea what was going on. So that, you know, obviously sparked conversation. But I think actually what this raises for me too is just why listening is so important, and to think of listening beyond sort of like the traditional ways maybe that anthropologists have taken it up, and think of it, and that's why I cite Feld and acoustemology as like a skill or a technique or something that's learned and sharpened in certain ways dependent on your context. And I think it kind of goes back to the opening vignette in that there wasn't this like sort of agreed upon, like, okay, if this reaches this level of loudness, or if this like escalates to a certain point, you know, I'll give a signal or something, and that means we should leave. Like, it, you know, it was very much in flux. The room that we were in played a huge role into that, the way that the sounds of the chants and the people speaking and the police like reverberated. Like, I think if we were in a smaller, you know, community center or something, maybe it wouldn't have seemed as sort of aggressive or rowdy. And so like, I think in this way, like the listening becomes like, or sound becomes a barometer for both the police and the activists to kind of make on the fly assessments without sort of, you know, we're not going to like turn to each other and say, do you think we should like go? Like that, it was a felt thing. It kind of gets to the tactility of sound, like, you know, this, we feel that this is getting out of hand, so maybe we should go. So that kind of thing.
Interesting. Thank you.
Stephen, we have two questions that are very similar. I'm going to combine them. Emily Sanantham and also Robin Gunn, and they both are asking or saying that they would love to hear some of your soundscapes, some of your recorded soundscapes. And Emily says, have you studied the relationship between sound and behaviors that different sounds engender?
Yeah, I mean, to the first point, I have a lot of recordings, so I'm slowly working through them and kind of editing them together. So I'm hoping I can find some way to upload them somewhere, and that'll definitely be part of the dissertation. And then for the second part, could you repeat that again? Sorry.
Sure, of course. Have you studied the relationship between sound and behaviors that different sounds engender?
Oh, right. So actually, I mean, that was the disappointing thing. I talked a little bit about how I was planning to do sound walks, and that was like very much a huge part of why I wanted to do that was, you know, it's not just about the conversation that a sound walk would provoke, but it would be a way for me to observe like movement and sort of, you know, does X sound cause someone to recoil, to move in a different direction? Because it's, you know, the way I would have approached the sound walk is to kind of let my participant like guide the route and kind of go as a kind of, you know, rather than like a predetermined route. So I guess kind of like the equivalent of like a semi-structured interview rather than something super structured. And actually on the Sounding Out blog, they've written about this, sort of like the sounds of catwalking and sort of gendered experiences of being in certain cities and harassment and these sorts of things. So, I mean, the two are very much, you know, linked, but it didn't necessarily come up so explicitly, I think, because with the latter half being virtual, it was really hard to kind of grasp that in a way that I would have been able to in person with the sound walks.
Here's a question that to some extent you referred to through your comparison of acoustic protests in Latin America, Stephen, but it says, have you been able to compare your Bushwick data with soundscape trends across other gentrifying cities throughout the US? I'm sure sounds of dissent and protest differ based on the specific racial and economic makeups of each city, but I'd be interested to hear about any overlaps or differences you've identified.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to that in my analysis yet. It's definitely something that I know there's some work on DC and the soundscapes of protest there. So I'll be curious to listen to that and compare it. But I think I think it raises why I think sound is so productive for these sorts of things, is that it does resist borders, like this question is getting at, and that's why I think it's so useful for a political anthropology, in that my work is very much about the soundscapes that I observed in Bushwick. But I mean, there's a reason we kind of like know that there's a link between sort of gentrifiers making complaints about long-timers, and that's like a recognizable thing that we can see, and there's a reason that exists, and it allows for, you know, certain similar kinds of patterns to have us think about gentrification and how it operates across neighborhoods. I know, like, you know, sometimes with the work that I did, I would go to like Bed-Stuy, which is a bordering neighborhood to Bushwick, and you know, the sound is very much policed, and noise, I guess more specifically, in a very similar way there. So I think it is a way to scale up my findings, and I'm hoping that's what it, you know, what it leads to.
We have a question from Deb Winslow. Thank you for an interesting talk. I am curious about the relationship between kinds of sounds and actual decibel levels. Which seems to be the most important? And do the kinds of sounds that are or are not objectionable, are they different in different places, or is it predictable that X sort of sound will always be objectionable in American gentrifying neighborhoods?
I don't think it's predictable. I mean, to a certain extent, obviously, like, there are sounds that just are dangerous for us, like when it reaches certain decibel levels. And there's been some work on how, like, the subways in New York do reach that and exceed that, and the constant exposure that we have to that noise is quite dangerous, actually. I don't think it's necessarily that one is more important than the other, but I do think that there's such attention paid to decibels, and it's such a narrow, I guess, way of thinking about sound, and my hope is in kind of locating sound to a particular place and among a particular community, it can sort of de-essentialize it and denaturalize it as a given that this kind of sound operates the same in everywhere. And so often, there's actually a recent book on remapping sound studies, and kind of talks about the way that ideologies of the global South and sound are so intertwined, and a need to kind of unsettle that. And I think that that's the kind of work, and that's why I'm very much invested in tracing the linkages between the sounds that the activists that I worked with deployed to, like, you know, as I mentioned, Latin American dissent. There's a historical lineage there, and there's an intention there that I think it's important to pay attention to. So I think it's less sort of about creating a hierarchy than it is just understanding how sound can tell us about politics, about history, about place, and those sorts of things.
I've got a related question from Carol McLennan. She asks, can you say more about how changing ideas of sound versus noise, which you've already referred to some extent, during gentrification have affected policy changes, that is to say, noise ordinances? Are those ordinances changing in your research area?
In some ways, they're not changing necessarily, but I think how they're being deployed is certainly heightened because of gentrification. And actually, I think the way I'm thinking about it is more less a one-to-one sort of like noise ordinances, gentrification, than what happens to the neighborhood soundscapes when certain communities are displaced. So I'm trying to sort of make the connection between something that's less obviously connected to sound, like a rezoning, because it very much changes the composition of what sorts of buildings, what kind of residences, how much affordable housing there are, and that necessarily has a huge effect on who can live there, disproportionately affecting the long-timers who are mostly non-white. And so I'm kind of thinking about it in that sense, like more of a roundabout way than a straight one-to-one, like, okay, noise ordinances, how are they being changed? How are they being regulated?
We have a number of more questions. Here's one from Miriam Kolar, who is an archaeoacoustician. She's an archaeologist who studies sound, and she was at SAR a few years ago. Sorry you didn't overlap. She writes, your work brings to mind Emily Thompson's historical explorations. For example, The Soundscape of Modernity, that chronicles ways in which control of the sonic environment has aligned with privilege, both in Europe and in early 20th century urban spaces in the United States. Have you considered how your work contributes to the documentation, and therefore historicity, of perspectives across classes and communities? Do you see yourself as contributing to the historical record in any particular way?
Yeah, I think in two ways kind of come to mind. First, and it's actually sort of, I think, how I sort of presented my work to the interlocutors that I ended up working with was, I very much want to create an archive of the activism that was going on in Bushwick in this particular moment in the city. And I think in another way, the way I'm kind of thinking about it is the way that nuisance as like a term, as something that's policed, is constructed, and that, I mean, that has like such deep kind of like colonial history. It deals with aesthetics and politics in very interesting ways, and that I think like very much comes up with the kind of protests that I participated in with the interlocutors that I worked with. Was, you know, if we think about policing, there's a lot of like legal anthropology work that looks at this too, like how video recordings of police brutality are deconstructed, and how it depends very much on sensory matters like what's visible, what's heard, and these sorts of things. And, you know, in the vignette that I presented in this presentation, you know, how we were kind of read as a nuisance, and therefore, you know, sort of legitimizing the threat of arrest. You know, we can think about noise, I guess, as like a barometer for which policing is enacted, and sort of, and that goes, and that's just like very much what I think a nuisance is about, is, you know, what's disturbing the peace, like, and then kind of looking at the other side of that, like, okay, what is, you know, like, what is the ideal then of this space, of this neighborhood space, of this lobby that we're in, and what's the breach? So.
Mm-hmm.
Jay Wilson says, wonderful discussion. I'd like to inquire from your observation of the Bushwick community, what was the impact of and barriers to those who are physically or mentally handicapped? And secondly, what would be some measures to help them in amplifying their ability to make their sounds adequately incorporated into their community?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, certainly the main vignette in my presentation, like the group that went inside the lobby, that was very much not accessible, but I think the outside march was, and that I think that came up in some of the planning. So there is sort of like an acknowledgement that, you know, accessibility is very much dictates how, you know, the level of involvement that certain folks can have with political activism and traditional forms of protest and march. I don't know that it came up as like a explicit conversation, at least in the group that I worked with. And actually, I'll change that. There was so the organizing center that the group kind of would meet at frequently was actually very like not accessible at all, and that was a sticking point where I think they were trying to move the space because of that, and that was like the main thing. I mean, the space was otherwise like a nice kind of community center that became like a home for a lot of people, but because of the accessibility issues, like it was on a second, third floor with no elevator. There was like intention to change that. So I think it's very much in the consciousness of the activists and organizers there.
Yeah, thanks.
We have a final question here from Jake Williams. Great talk, thank you. How much does music playing in public spaces feature in your study? Are gentrifiers more likely to complain about music noise? Could there be ways of learning how to listen to appreciate the sound of culture rather than see it as a nuisance? Sorry, that's 3 questions in a row. How much does music playing feature in your study? Are gentrifiers more likely to complain, and are there ways to learn to appreciate sound?
I think because so much of the sound studies and anthro sound literature already deals with music, I think I was trying to intentionally not center it. I mean, certainly it's part of it. The way I'm thinking about music is both in terms of the where, like spatially where it's located, and genres obviously bring up certain questions about how people are using certain genres to mark their presence. Like I think it's not that it's an act of resistance in an explicit sense, but it is sort of something that takes political urgence or is meaningful in a new way when a car does pass by blasting like reggaeton music in a part that they've been like a part of the neighborhood that they've been displaced from. Like, that takes on a different kind of meaning and tenor when it's, in the process of gentrification. And the kind of the park that I mentioned, that's an area where there's like almost always music playing. And I was paying attention to what kind of technologies were being used. Was it a boombox? Was it, were people singing? Like what was going on? And then also the ways that a lot of or a lot of like white sort of residents, or bars that kind of cater to a newcomer kind of crowd. Some of them would even sort of like play genres of music like reggaeton, like salsa and these sorts of things. And in a way, it almost kind of, it gets at a lot of what's been written about gentrification, I think, in terms of like the desire for an authentic experience of a neighborhood and, feeling like you're in a distinct place that's maybe separate from where you came from. And so I think those are kinds of the things I'm thinking of in terms of like the observations that I made in neighborhood gatherings in the park and elsewhere, like, and also just the activists. I mean, they made such heavy use of music in these like kind of posts that were intended to go viral, that were shaming local politicians for some of the policies they were enacting, but they were done like with humor and with music that kind of was more joyful, and so all this kind of mixing of genre and humor and irony, and that's kind of what I was getting at with the kind of chapter I want to do on the ways that activism traveled between social media, online, and also offline spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much for a memorable discussion. We look forward to seeing the rest of your work as your dissertation moves forward. And again, we've had a lot of people who seem to have enjoyed it, and we welcome them to our future presentations as well.
Thank you both.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone.
I look forward to catching up more. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.